Yevgeny Prigozhin was a complicated figure in Russia. A life filled with crime and strict loyalty to one of the worst people in the world today. From small beginnings to joining the ranks of the few billionaires who walk the earth today. This is the story of a man who started as a criminal, reformed himself, built a culinary empire, fell back into his old ways, became a shadowy military leader, and ultimately found himself at the mercy of Vladimir Putin, the man who made him. Like Putin, Yevgeny Prigozhin was born in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, Russia. He spent much of his young adult life in prison after stealing and being caught choking a woman during a robbery. For almost 5 years, he was an unruly prisoner, violating his solitary confinement and just being a generally difficult person. But then something changed in him. He realized he could be more than someone who's destined to rot in prison. So he begins working on his character. He started reading a lot, and he decides to make something of himself. 3 years of this reformed Prigozhin eventually led the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union to allow him to be released on good behavior. After 9 long years in prison, Yevgeny Prigozhin is free, and he could start to become the man that he was meant to be all along. He had his start in entrepreneurship selling hot dogs with his parents. He was a natural businessman, as many misfits are. Pretty soon they had a whole army of hot dog stands, and more money than they even knew what to do with. The 1990s in Russia was a time of turmoil as well as opportunity. Prigozhin recognized this and did anything he could to stay on top. He built many different businesses, some having massive success and others struggling. He was a man who quickly learned how to pivot in a rapidly changing market. This pivot mentality brought about his restaurants in St. Petersburg. People were tired of the same boring Soviet foods being served around town. So he has the idea to make an upscale floating restaurant where he could host prominent people. And it was during this time that he became acquainted with Putin, who dined at his establishment.
Known as Putin's chef, he developed a close relationship with the Russian president, a fellow son of St. Petersburg.
It's important to note here that at this time, Prigozhin was also opening up casinos and putting stripteases in some of his restaurants, and was even known to physically beat his employees when there was any kind of misconduct. I can only imagine that under the stress of intense entrepreneurship, his past self was starting to resurface. His new relationship with Putin in the 2000s skyrockets his wealth and power. Prigozhin begins winning contract after contract with the government to provide food for soldiers and school children. The quality of his food is terrible, and it even brings a dysentery outbreak at one point, but neither Putin nor Prigozhin care about this. Putin is the reason for Prigozhin's meteoric rise, and Prigozhin is completely aware of this. In a bid to further their relationship, Prigozhin founds the Internet Research Agency to meddle with foreign affairs and promote the Kremlin's goals abroad. Undoubtedly on Putin's orders, Prigozhin's new agency meddles in the 2016 US election, which was enough for the US State Department to offer $10 million to anyone with information that could lead to Prigozhin's arrest. Later on, Prigozhin would even admit to this election interference and confidently say that he'll meddle in future elections as well. About a year later, in 2014, Russia invades and annexes Crimea, part of Ukraine. With a need for unmarked military forces to keep the blame off of Russia, Putin authorizes Prigozhin to form a new hidden branch of their military. It would be called the Wagner Group. At the time, little was known about the Wagner Group. It was a shadowy private military, a mercenary group that Russia claimed they had zero ties with. At the same time, Wagner soldiers were seen to be sharing bases with the Russian military. The group began to grow rapidly. Wagner mercenaries were found in Africa, supporting the Kremlin's goals to secure rare earth minerals and further Putin's agenda.
Of the support of autocratic regimes through muscle, brutality, and propaganda in exchange for access to resources, particularly mining operations, as well as political support against the West.
It was during this time that more and more horrible war crimes were being reported, linked to this shadowy organization. Brutality was common, as is often the case with a military group that doesn't have to adhere to government restrictions. The Wagner Group played a key role in the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was during this time that we started to learn more about what exactly the Wagner Group was, and what its ties were to Prigozhin as well as Russia. Wagner soldiers are shown to be brutal on the battlefield. Videos start surfacing of Prigozhin making threats to his soldiers, and carrying out horrible executions of people who tried to defect.
They would round up those who did not want to fight and shoot them in front of the newcomers to develop their self-preservation instinct.
Putin authorizes Prigozhin to start recruiting soldiers from Russian prisons, offering them a full pardon if they join the group, with the caveat that there will be no choice to go back to prison. They can either fight or line up for the firing squad.
Вариантов вернуться на зону нет никаких. Те, кто приезжает и в первый день говорит, куда-то я не туда попал, мы делаем отметку дезертир, и после этого следует расстрел.
At this point, Prigozhin's empire is deeply rooted and intertwined within the Russian government. He has become one of the most powerful people in Russia. He controls much of the food of the Russian military. He has vast control over the media and the internet with his agency. And now he has 50,000 unmarked soldiers at his command. His men love the exclusive feel of their shadowy organization, as well as the special treatment that they get in regards to what they can get away with. On top of this, they're trained better, being in a smaller, somewhat private organization, rather than a large government-run military group. Prigozhin is ruthless with disloyalty, but he seems to care a lot about his men when they serve him. On top of that, all of his recruits from the prisons that we already talked about, they absolutely love the guy because he is an ex-convict just like them. All of this results in a private military group that's more loyal to Prigozhin than they are to Putin. If you haven't watched my last video, I talked all about what went wrong with Putin's invasion. Needless to say, the war has not been going to plan for Russia. In May of 2023, Prigozhin is furious with how the war has been handled. He doesn't blame Putin though, and that's a big key here. There are two possible reasons for this. One, Prigozhin could very likely still be loyal to Putin. Again, Putin is the man who made him. Number two, blaming Putin for anything publicly is a dangerous thing to do in Russia. So Prigozhin very well could have just been waiting for the right time.
У нас нехватка боеприпасов 70%! Шойгу! Герасимов! Где боеприпасы? Посмотрите на них, Если вы даете норму боеприпасов, их в 5 раз меньше.
Instead, he blames Sergei Shoigu, Russia's defense minister, and Valery Gerasimov, the chief of staff of Russian armed forces, for poor handling of the war, which has resulted in tens of thousands of Wagner soldiers dying. Prigozhin withdraws his loyal army and heads back to Russia. He captures 2 cities and claims that he's headed for Moscow to take down Shoigu and Gerasimov. Prigozhin never once says anything negative about Putin, but continues his march to Moscow to cleanse the Kremlin of these corrupt leaders. During this march, they shoot down a Russian military plane and multiple helicopters. The world starts speculating that this could be the end for Putin. His forces are already spread thin, and the Wagner army is advancing on Moscow quickly. Then Putin announces to his country that Prigozhin is a traitor and an enemy of the state.
Защитим и наш народ, и нашу государственность от любых угроз, в том числе от внутреннего предательства. А то, с чем мы столкнулись, это именно предательство. Непомерные амбиции и личные интересы привели к измене. Тот, кто организовал и готовил военный мятеж, кто поднял оружие на боевых товарищей, предали Россию и ответят за это.
I can only imagine that this shook Prigozhin to the core because of what happened next. Prigozhin stopped his march and attempted to establish contact with Putin, but all he got was silence from his old friend and mentor. Putin eventually allows some of his officers to broker a deal with Prigozhin. He is to be exiled to Belarus and step down as the commander of the Wagner Group, and all of the charges against him would be dropped. With Putin's approval ratings at an all-time high in Russia, I don't think that Prigozhin was actually trying to overthrow him. I think he was trying to free him from terrible yes-men advisors that were waging a war with little to no strategy and probably hoping to be promoted in the process. But Putin didn't see it that way. This was the first real perceived threat to his throne. It was something that weakened the public's perception of him. And in Putin's own words, he will never forgive betrayal.
А вы умеете прощать?
Да. Но не все.
А что невозможно простить?
Предательство.
So Prigozhin is exiled to Belarus, and the charges against him are dropped, but he still remains under investigation for treason. It wasn't surprising when 2 months later to the day, Prigozhin's private jet mysteriously exploded midair, with Prigozhin on board. Putin, the godfather of Russia, added Prigozhin to his list of over 24 officials that he's assassinated just because they stepped out of line. The unique aspect of this assassination, though, was that Prigozhin remained loyal to the man that made him, all the way up until the end.
I want to express sincere condolences to the families of all those who died. It is always a tragedy. Indeed, if they were there, and according to the initial information, Wagner company employees were on board. I want to note that those people made a significant contribution to our common cause of fighting the Nazi regime in Ukraine. We remember this, we know this, and we will not forget this.
The life and death of Yevgeny Prigozhin is truly a remarkable thing. He was an evil man who directly caused the deaths of thousands of people and the suffering of millions. As of this video, he's the only man who has challenged Putin's power in a significant way, even if it wasn't his intention. Truly, the world is a better place without him, but it's unfortunate that his death seems to have solidified Putin's power. We have yet to see how this saga will play out, and we can only hope that it de-escalates rather than progresses and causes more death and destruction. I made a documentary about Putin's invasion of Ukraine and everything that went wrong. It's 27 minutes long, super interesting, with some very powerful interviews that I shot. I would say it's the most important video I've ever made in my life up to this point. It sheds light on a lot of the atrocities and terrible things that have happened in Ukraine so far. I definitely recommend checking it out.